Well, they said he couldn't do it, but he's doing it. In a few days' time, Prime Minister Anthony Albanese, fresh from a week's holiday, will be flying to Washington to meet President Trump. So today we're going to talk about what he hopes to achieve there, and we're also going to delve into what really went on between the PM and his Treasurer, Jim Chalmers, over the super reforms that Jim Chalmers abandoned this week. Paul Sakkal said the Treasurer had his pants pulled down by the PM, which is, an interesting phrasing. But is he right? As always, I'm joined by Chief Political Correspondent Paul Sakkal, and also our special guest star, Chief Economics Correspondent Shane Wright is joining us. Hi, guys.
I'm still waiting for the music to come in for my special guest appearance.
I know.
Jackie.
I keep forgetting to push the button. I do want to do a shout out to Shane Wright's T-shirt, which, if you're listening and not watching, it's a Kate Bush tribute, which would fetch a lot of good money in a vintage store. No offense.
She's no vintage star. She's live and pumping it all out.
She is.
I didn't realise my comments to you in private, Jack, will make it into your intro, so I've got to be a bit careful now going forward.
Oh, right, the pulling pants down thing.
Yeah.
Should we can all...
No, I'm just joking. That's fine. I stand by it.
I thought it was very colourful phrasing, and we'll get into what it really means later. Paul, when does the Prime Minister leave for Washington?
He leaves on Sunday, I believe, in the afternoon, and it's a quick trip because he just spent, I think, nearly 10 days in New York.
Longer.
Yeah, it was about 3 or 4 days in London, maybe 10 days in New York for the United Nations General Assembly, which was about a fortnight ago. So he's all jet-lagged out and keen to do some domestic politics ahead of even more summits at the end of this month at ASEAN and APEC. So it's a quick trip. He'll be in Washington for 2 working days. I believe he meets with Trump on Tuesday at 2 a.m. Australian time. So you're going to be pretty hardcore to stay up that late or wake up at that time or feel like a Socceroos World Cup game when just the diehards on Twitter are live tweeting through it.
Yep.
There could be an interesting scoreline, though, out of this one.
Yeah, you never know.
Who do you reckon? Which way? Will this be a Fabio Grosso Italy versus Socceroos style national tragedy moment or a conquest?
This is one of the great questions, and as I'm not going to express an opinion on the Socceroos, as I am not an expert in that field, but yes, it could. This could go any way.
It could. I mean, and Paul's got views on that too. I know. The PM, of course, copped a lot of criticism from the media about the fact that he hadn't gotten a meeting with Trump since his inauguration in January, and that it was all too late. But now he's got the meeting. What form will the meeting take? Do we know?
It's not a formal state visit. There'll be no big state dinner and it will not be full of that kind of pomp. It's been called a working visit, which will take the form of, Albo walking into the Oval Office, do a quick handshake photograph and then a longer sit-down meeting in the Oval Office. There may be a huge pack of journalists in there asking all kinds of questions, and it may be a more rambunctious affair.
Yeah, but the actual meeting itself obviously takes place in private, and then they ask the journalists in. Yeah, so and that could be a freewheeling press conference. That's sort of where the fireworks happen, right? With a Trump press conference, because you never know what he's going to say. There's always, I think, a little bit of tension, dramatic or otherwise, on the part of the foreign leader who's visiting, and then of course you've got the White House press corps, which are by no means a conventional press corps anymore. So, what does he want to accomplish in this meeting? What does he need to accomplish in this meeting? He's got to really make it work for him, right?
Yeah, there's a lot of pressure going into it. Although it's only a few days away now, and there's not a huge amount of media speculation about it. I'm surprised at how long it's taken for attention to turn to it. And I wonder if that's because there's a bit of fatigue on previewing this potential meeting, because it was meant to occur at Canada at the G7 in whenever that was, June, and then it was meant to happen again at the United Nations General Assembly. And so I wonder if people are just a bit sick of forecasting what will occur.
Tell us quickly what he needs to do there, because you wrote about that this week.
Well, critical minerals is turning into... Well, I interviewed Richard Marles, the Defence Minister and Deputy Prime Minister last week, and I said, how big a deal is this becoming geopolitically for Australia as it crystallises in the minds of many Western leaders, but in particular Trump and his key allies, that this is a core part of the contest with China. So to explain to listeners, critical minerals are a whole bunch of elements in the periodic table that are becoming much more in demand because they're used in modern defence technologies and really core to the green revolution for solar panels and magnets and also semiconductors and many different new modern age products. China has cornered this market for about 20 or 30 years. So they mine about 75% and they produce about 90%.
Yep.
They're not actually that rare. There are many big deposits in the world, but they're very expensive to mine. But Australia has a tremendous amount. We effectively have the whole periodic table, but we've not invested enough in it over time to actually bring them out of the ground.
Yep.
The US now acknowledges that Australia is arguably the most important place it can start supplying critical minerals from. And so there's a huge push being led by Kevin Rudd in Washington, who's been doing this for the best part of 2 years, to get US and European investment to dig it out of Australia and create a non-China supply chain. And Richard Marles' argument was that, this is not some second-tier interest of Trump. This is a core interest of the Trump administration, brought to light last week when China started again restricting these exports to the US, which has sparked another bout in the trade war between China and the US.
And Shane, our economic interests really align with the US on this. I mean, we also need these critical minerals, and we are also reliant on China if China's got more or less a monopoly on at least producing them, because they're very dirty to produce and expensive, as Paul said.
Yeah, I don't know if the economic interests align specifically with the US as also China. Remember, China is still the big cash cow for this country with iron ore. So the context is there are two big competing forces for these minerals. We can't refine them and use them because we're too small a country. We're too far away from the main sources, like some of the stuff that ends up in semiconductors, which are vital to the AI revolution. Like, we are not going to replicate Taiwan and become a great producer of semiconductors. So ultimately, we actually have a really strong position economically with both powers, because China does have 75%, but they don't have all of them. They're not as easy to mine in parts of China as they are in Australia. Like, you get out into parts of Western Australia, pick it up, dig it out, off you go. A lot easier. So I find it really interesting that that economic power play that's going on between China and the US, and how central Australia is to both of those nations.
So we're almost like we're a pivot point, or we've got leverage on both sides.
Yeah.
Paul, I want to ask you about tariffs as well, because that's another thing that Albanese will be perhaps delicately raising in this meeting. What does he want to achieve on tariffs?
Well, we're subject to the lowest baseline tariff of 10%. No country has had that, has been exempted from that.
Yeah. This is an across-the-board tariff.
Across-the-board tariff, which in a relative sense, given much of the world is at a higher baseline rate, we are put at a competitive advantage because of that. And the Productivity Commission has actually said that we might benefit in the long run if other countries escalate and do reciprocal tariffs. That hasn't quite happened yet to the extent that we thought, but we're still yet to see the consequences of what happens with China and the US, which has been delayed, the consequences of that tariff war, in part because the US backed away from Chinese tariffs, because when China responded by blocking critical minerals, Ford and other car manufacturers said, hey, can we not tariff them? Because we actually need these things to build cars and our economy will stop. So these things are all intertwined. Don Farrell, every time he speaks, the trade minister says, we still want to get rid of that 10% and we still want to get rid of that steel and aluminium tariff. I think there's more. That's more of a talking point now than anything.
So
I don't think the government.
Does that mean that Albanese just won't raise tariffs, or will he sort of say, mate, do you want to think about that 10% and then just drop it?
I think he'll raise it because it has to be part of the readout, the readout being what they tell the Australian public he raised.
Yeah.
We can't be seen to have given up on it, but I don't think there's any likelihood of dropping the 10%. There is a prospect if they're in some broader critical minerals deal, which the government is very quiet about, given the sensitivity, that there's a potential that we get some sort of carve out in the steel and aluminium space, and maybe a deal to ensure that CSL, the drug manufacturer, doesn't get caught up in the pharmaceutical tariffs. Yeah. Keir Starmer got some adjustments to auto tariffs and steel, I believe, when he did a deal with Trump.
But he got an adjustment. They're still paying tariffs, and the US budget, and like Scott Bessant, the Treasury Secretary, keeps reminding him, you actually need the tariff revenue because of the huge deficit that the United States pays. So like the whole argument that you'll get a country like whichever political leader turns up in Washington says get an exclusion on tariffs. Trump cannot do that without absolutely crushing even further a terrible budget situation.
So just really quickly, Shane, and this is probably a much bigger conversation, but, we heard so much panic mongering amongst people like yourself, economists, about the tariffs and that they were going to crash the US economy and they were going to push up inflation. And, people were even worried about a sort of global recession in some cases. What has been the impact of the tariffs so far that we can see?
It's pushing up inflation. It's starting to slow the American economy.
Yep.
If it wasn't for the AI data build-out that's occurring across the United States, the US would be in recession right now.
Right.
And Trump is causing that. The thing that hasn't happened, and every economist is going, thank God, is that there hasn't been the retribution from everybody else.
Yeah.
That's what it all swung on, because at this point, Trump is causing pain to his own economy and to his own residents. And you can see that as much as, like, we hear about how successful Trump is, he is so underwater in the American polls, all of the opinion polls.
Oh, yeah.
Because of the cost of living pressures that are going on, and because you can see the softness in the jobs market. And you can see businesses bought a lot of pre-tariff products into the US.
Yeah.
And they're now having to start pass on that increase in prices.
So there's a lag effect, but it's only going to
There is a lag.
The momentum on the inflation front is only going to build on the US economy. I just want to switch now. Obviously, Albanese will be talking also about AUKUS. Just very quickly, because you did have this interesting interview with Richard Marles that was published this week, where he talked about how Vice President J.D. Vance is actually sort of like the Trump whisperer, or the guy that Marles really wanted to build a connection with in order to sort of have an end to the Trump administration. Tell us about what Marles said.
Yeah, well, there was this much discussed trip that Marles did. He was a bit secretive. He went without giving the Australian media much notice in August.
Yeah.
And it was a key part of the focus from the Australian media was whether he would get this formal meeting with Pete Hegseth, his defence counterpart. He's met Pete Hegseth a number of times before. But Marles opened up in an interview with me last week on the real purpose of that trip, and the key thing he was seeking to do was to build a political deputy-to-deputy relationship with J.D. Vance. J.D. Vance is doing a lot of one-to-ones with foreign leaders, Keir Starmer and others. He's been seen as a kind of intellectual thought leader of the MAGA foreign policy. He's clearly a very influential figure, close to Trump. Many people think he'll succeed Trump. And so Marles said that that's a key relationship for the government to effectively build trust, to emphasise the points of shared values, shared language, shared strategy in the Indo-Pacific with Vance, and to use that as a way to pave the way for Albanese to meet Trump this month.
Yeah.
Marles, as you said, Jack, AUKUS will be key to the meeting as well. The Pentagon's still reviewing it. Marles said that he received only positive feedback from Marco Rubio, J.D. Vance, Pete Hegseth, and Stephen Miller, Trump's influential deputy chief of staff, during that 1 and 2 days of meetings, which was really, to give Marles credit, this government's copped a lot of flack for their relations with the Trump administration, some of it justified, some of it not. But to meet those 4 guys within the space of, I think it was really 1 day, is a pretty impressive swing through Washington.
Just coming back to the domestic front, obviously the Prime Minister's in such a powerful position at the moment. He's flying high in the polls. He's had all these sort of foreign policy successes. He's almost sort of like floating above domestic politics in a way at the moment. Meanwhile, the opposition is sort of blowing itself up. But we did see this week that there was the back down on the super changes. And I know we've already canvassed in other podcasts like the sort of ins and outs of the actual changes themselves. It was basically an abandonment of these reforms, or a partial abandonment of these reforms, that they were hoping to get more tax from high super earners. I want to talk about the politics of it, because it was reported that, as Paul said, that Chalmers got his pants pulled down by the PM. That the PM basically overruled him and said, "Look, you got to get rid of this." Shane, what happened?
Yeah, ultimately this is how past relationships between treasurers and prime ministers work. Hawke Keating, Howard Costello, Hockey and Abbott, which a lot of people tend to forget what went on there. There's always a tension.
Yeah.
And in this case, Albanese's effectively said, come up with something different.
Yeah.
And that's what he's done. The ultimate end game is that the tax on high-end superannuants is going up.
Yeah.
by not an inconsequential amount, but nowhere near by as much.
And it leaves Jim Chalmers with a problem because now he's got a hole in the budget where, the projections of what they were going to save with those costings is sort of gone.
And it's really one of their only savings measures.
I
wouldn't
that's
call it
right.
a savings measure. This was a revenue measure.
Yeah,
this was increasing tax.
Revenue measure to actually bring in cash.
Yeah, so this I think, rule of thumb, rather than say 40 billion, which is we actually have some idea because the Liberal Party went to the last election saying we're going to repeal this tax. So there was an analysis done by the Parliamentary Budget Office which said the cost of repealing that tax, the original tax proposal, was 44 billion over the next 10 years.
Yep.
Nothing to sneeze at. The cost of that was much larger for the coalition because they were going to blow up
The whole thing.
there was going to be extra government debt as well, so the total cost was 50 bill. Coming back to where Chalmers has ended up, the change to indexation, well, by indexing these thresholds, he has changed remarkably how much they're going to earn. I'm thinking at about half of that 40.
But they haven't given us any official costings on we were saying back then that we were going to save all this money, but now it's actually only going to be this tiny amount of money.
Well, you
it's not
you
tiny,
say 43 billion's is a lot and 20 billion's nothing. Like I don't know where you shop, Jack, but
more than half. It's more than half.
I'm getting worried, Jack, about your spending proclivities.
I know. I mean, yeah. So am I. I guess what I'm saying is, what I'm trying to get at is that they had this economic roundtable, which was obviously pushed by Jim Chalmers. They were like, we're really interested in tax reform. We're open to it. It's on the table. But they're not really, are they?
No, there are other things coming.
What?
There are?
Oh,
What's coming?
I'm not going to give it all
pull
away
your
right
punches
now,
on
but
this podcast.
I think you will see the next budget. There'll be more changes.
Okay.
Right. Everyone's forgotten what actually went on during those 3 days, and we focus on tax.
Yeah.
But say, for instance, this week, a big shift, which the Reserve Bank has been banging on about, is the lack of competition in the country.
Yes.
The government's competition reforms in that space actually took another step forward this week.
EPBC Act is coming.
EPBC, there are those things, like ultimately they are good for the economy and for the budget, but they are not nearly as sexy as, a tax change.
Yeah. Paul, Treasurers and Prime Ministers have to work together. Their success depends on each other. They're so interdependent, and yet they do, always traditionally have a rivalry. Do we see any of that with Albanese and Chalmers? I know they have a good working relationship. I would not say, you couldn't say at the moment that they have a rivalry with each other, but could there be a rivalry in the future? They have very different interests, don't they?
Yeah. There's a big age gap between them as well. Chalmers is from the Queensland right. Yeah. Albanese is from the Labor left. They're institutionally different characters. Yeah. I mean, they are both, I think Phil Curry wrote this week, both kind of working class guys who love rugby leagues. There's some similarities there, but they're from different parts of the party. They have fundamentally different interests in terms of Chalmers trying to build himself up to become the Prime Minister and Albanese trying to retain this immense power and this special position he has now with this big majority. But it's not, you mentioned earlier, Jack, and I'm not to quibble with your language, but it's not just my view that he got rolled by the PM. He just did.
Yep.
Chalmers has been defending this policy for 2 years, not giving any room to the criticism that taxing paper profits might set a bad precedent for the government, for it to be potentially, if a negative scare campaign is launched by the Liberal Party, to suggest that it would be used on the family home or whatever else. He gave no room to that theory. The Prime Minister, before the election, we reported this yesterday, started to become concerned about the prospects of a scare campaign.
Yep.
He decided not to make any changes pre-election because Angus Taylor, who was widely criticised as an incompetent shadow treasurer, didn't weaponise the issue.
Yep.
Tim Wilson then got elected after the election. Tim Wilson, the master of a big scare campaign against the Labor tax policy. He started banging the drum through the Australian Financial Review and other newspapers. The Australian became interested through their economics correspondent, who was just quite dogmatic about this policy. And so the campaign, very unusually, came to life after the election. And so this raised up the fear in the Prime Minister's mind, again, that he had pre-election. And around the time of the economic roundtable, which was August, which we spent a lot of time in here calling Canberra's Coachella, the Prime Minister said to Chalmers, look, we're not going forward with this proposal in its current form. I'm not going to tell you how to suck eggs. You need to own this, but it can't have these components of unrealised gains and no indexation.
Yeah.
Come up with a new plan that's my order. I was told the Prime Minister barely even consulted his cabinet on this. He made a call off his own judgment with some key lieutenants.
Yeah.
And Chalmers was forced to announce this on Albanese's first day in the Pacific Islands on holiday. It was a proverbial sandwich for the Treasurer and kind of leads to questions about his authority around the cabinet table and his ability to pursue reform. If he's been forced to back down on something that, many commentators, I think rightfully said was not as big a deal as some of the critics made out, then what does that say about his ability to do bigger things?
Well, that's what I'm sort of interested in on an interpersonal level, because it's a humiliating thing to have to back down publicly from this policy that you've been touting and really backing for 2 years. How does that feel for Chalmers, and does that not breed some resentment towards the Prime Minister, who maybe could have let him know a little bit sooner, perhaps, that he was not in favour of this, reasonable sort of change in a lot of people's minds?
Well, it's a good question. I can't read Chalmers' mind. I mean, he was pretty stony-faced in that press conference on Monday in the Blue Room. He's a master politician, Jim Chalmers. He knows how these things work. I think he did as good a job as possible as presenting this new change as good reform. And in some ways, it is good reform. What he did to the top
low
tax
income
bracket and the low-income measure to give the Greens something, the new policy is not... It will have more fans than the old policy. So I think he's found a good solution. But I think it marginalises Chalmers in the government. It enhances the idea that the Prime Minister has ultimate control. To your point earlier, Jack, about how the special position the Prime Minister is in, I don't know if I should say this, but I'll say it anyway. The Prime Minister was walking out of question time on Wednesday or Thursday last week, and there was a small group of people in the corridors, and he joked that the only thing his colleagues were split on was whether he's going to serve 5 or 6 terms. He was absolutely joking, but it's a sign of where he's at. Chalmers has been overshadowed by Tony Burke at the moment in some ways.
Right.
Mark Butler is growing in
I want to
power.
wind you back there. Yeah. Marginalising treasurers doesn't happen.
I'm not saying he's marginalised, but
You just said this marginalises the treasurer. I'm going to pull you up because historically the guy, and they've all been guys, who holds the finances of the country is impossible to marginalise, because remember, because you've got the treasury itself has and along with finance, they have so much control of everybody else's. So I've just like the political
I just
pressure.
think it's happened to you to some extent.
To some extent, but I don't think you can go, it's end of days.
Oh, no,
it's
no.
not, but marginalising it, because ultimately the budget is structured, like the budget, which is pivotal to how a government runs, that's
Totally.
the
Chalmers
purview
is a very
of the
good
treasurer of the
politician,
day.
and he'll bounce back, but this is a low moment.
Yeah. Thanks, guys. That was a very interesting, wild roving chat. I really enjoyed it. See you very soon.
Thanks,
It's always a pleasure to see you, Jack.